Okay, so we were on chapter 10, so I'm going to just carry on from there. You'll have to excuse me because I'm holding the book and the phone, so I might have to just sometimes put the book down for a second to turn the page. Right. I'm going to start just from the middle here, where if you remember there was the case and Zach had received different things from his parents and they were thinking about putting on some different kind of productions and things like that. Actually, said Zach, I've got another idea brewing. How about Sherlock Holmes? You could be Moriarty, George. The arch enemy? Yes, said Zach, surprised. How did you know? George raised his eyes. He was always the arch enemy, and Carrie was invariably his evil assistant. Does that mean I has to die or be rescued again? Said Jeanie. Well, not exactly, said Zach, a little perturbed. Anyway, as I was saying, Will, you could be... Dr. Watson, chorused children and the twins. Willie was always Zach's faithful assistant, and it was quite obvious, as soon as Sherlock Holmes was mentioned, that Zach would be the famous Deerstalker detective. How about sitting in a tree waiting for badgers, suggested George, or seeing if Spooky Cot is really haunted. Spooky Cot was the name given to a deserted cottage. It was surrounded by an undergrowth of tangled bushes and trees. Over the years, several people had reported hearing strange sounds emanating from it. George and the twins dared not venture near it except in the broadest of daylight. Even then, they usually fled at first sight of it. At night? Asked Jeanie, and she shivered. Yes, with a torch. Blackout regulations? Drat, said George. What about a show? Suggested Zach. We've got the school nativity play, said George, and Miss Thorne is already producing something for the Women's Guild. They sat in silence, racking their brains for an idea. Suddenly Zach yelled, I say, we could have a newspaper, a sort of gazette. Yeah, said Willie, who really liked the idea, but the others thought he was only supporting Zach because he was his special friend. Carrie glanced at Ginny, and George looked at Carrie and back to Zach. Come to think of it, it isn't a bad idea. I could do the animal bits. And I could do news from abroad and about the war, said Carrie. Some war, groaned George. It don't seem like it's even begun. And I could do a cookery and household tips column, piped in Ginny. What'll you do, Zach? Asked Carrie. I'll think of something, even if I have to put on a show myself. Village news, she cried. Extraordinary events in Little Weirwold. Willie can do the illustrations, and I think you'd better be editor, Carrie, suggested Zach. Me? She said. Why me? 'Cause you're the brainy one, said George. Let's vote for it then, said Zach, and immediately everyone raised their arms. Goodness, gasped Ginny, catching sight of the clock. We'll have to go. We'll be in trouble if we don't run for it. She, Carrie and George grabbed their coats and fled out of the room and down the stairs. When shall we meet next? Whispered Zach urgently after them. Can't tomorrow, said Carrie. We's babysitting, said Ginny. Sophie sitting, they added in unison. How about Thursday then? Choir practice, said George. Friday? Friday was agreed. They hurriedly whispered their goodbyes to each other, and after the front door had been closed, Willie followed Zach back into his bedroom. Now, said Zach, jumping onto the bed, I can read my letter. And he pulled out the crumpled envelope from his shorts. You don't mind, do you? He said, glancing at Willie, who had sat down beside him. No, answered Willie, course not. He wriggled back further on the bed till he was leaning up against the wall. He could hardly believe that Zach was his special friend. Zach said he was a good listener and that he was a sensitive being. Willie had thought being sensitive meant being a sissy. Zach didn't think so. He admired him for it. Admired him. He glanced over at Zach, He was lying sprawled across the pillow, leaning on his elbow, his head propped to one side, reading the letter. There seemed to be pages. His own mother had written to little Weirwold only once since his arrival 8 weeks ago, and the letter had been addressed to Mr. Tom. He had read it out to him, but he knew that he'd missed out bits. He had actually written a letter of his own to her, his first ever. He'd even addressed the envelope, bought the stamp by himself, and posted it. I expect she's been too busy to answer, he thought, what with the war and everything. For a brief moment he thought of his home in London and brushed the memory aside. There was a knock on the front door downstairs and the sound of Mrs. Little opening it. "That's Mr. Tom," said Willie, moving off the bed. Mrs. Little called up to him. "I got to go." "Bother," said Zack. They were at the top of the stairs when Zack touched his shoulder. "Don't forget about the room, will you?" he whispered. Willie shook his head and ran down the stairs. Tom was waiting for him at the bottom. Willie put his gabardine and cap on and slung his gas mask box over his shoulder. The sky was almost black when he and Tom stepped outside. A strong wind tore through the trees, whipping the branches fiercely to one side, while the rain swept across their faces. Tom put up the umbrella. "Best hang tight to my arm, boy," he yelled, and together they leaned forward and tramped through the long wet grass to wrestle with the Little's gate. Willie clung firmly to him. He pulled his cap down over his eyes, but the wind whistled bitterly through his ears. They passed the Bush family's cottage and struggled by the vicarage. The leaves flew and scattered around in fragments, brushing their bodies and sticking to their wet cheeks. They fought with the long gate into Dobbs's field, and Tom checked that she was sheltered. The wind tried to wrench the umbrella from his hand. He hung grimly on and wrestled with it until he could lower it in front of them. Half running, half walking, they fled through the back garden, narrowly missing the Anderson, and threw themselves into the passageway, the leaves swirling in after them. They slammed the door behind them and panted and smiled in the darkness. It was as if someone had suddenly turned off the sound. Tom opened the sitting room door and the silence was broken by Sammy as he came bounding out, leaping up at the pair of them, barking excitedly. Willie hung his gabardine and cap on his peg, while Sammy stood on his hind legs and placed his paws on his stomach. Willie ruffled his fur. "Has he been fed?" he asked. "No, lad, I left it for you." Willie grinned happily. It was one of his jobs to feed Sammy in the evenings. After he had fed him, he wiped his boots dry with an old rag, put the kettle on and sat down at the table with pencil and paper. "'Tis late for that," said Tom. "Just 10 minutes, pleaded Willie. "Mrs. Black says I can do me letters and me capitals better. I can start joining up writing soon." "No longer, though." "Ta." And with that he began writing. Tom made the tea and took down 2 large white mugs from hooks hanging by the window. One had a letter T on it, the other a letter W. Since Willie was so desperate to be accepted in Mrs. Hartridge's class, Tom had been helping in every possible way. He had stuck labels in various places so that Willie would associate an object with a word, until after a time Willie labelled them himself. He glanced at all the bits of paper hanging higgledy-piggledy on the furniture and walls. He hoped that Willie would manage to get into Mrs. Hartridge's class before she left. It had been announced only a month ago that she was expecting her first child and would probably be leaving after the spring term. He glanced at Willie, who had now finished writing. He was sitting quietly drinking his tea. It wasn't until after he had gone to bed that Willie asked about the room. He had remained subdued for the rest of the evening, glancing at Tom and looking away. It was Tom who finally eked it out of him. He had gone up as usual to turn Willie's lamp down and had found him sitting up in a bed with one of his library books lying open on his knees. Instead of tracing the pages with his finger as he usually did, he was staring vacantly into space. He came over to him, closed the book and put it on his table. "Now then," he said, crouching under the eave and seating himself comfortably at the foot of his bed. "What's it all about, eh?" Willie looked at him, startled. "What's eating you? You've been a brown cloud ever since supper." Willie took a deep breath. You see, he began, Edward won't let George in his room because of the war, and Zack says they're knitting boots in the sitting room, and the twin says they might only... Slow down, said Tom, and gets to the point. Mr. Tom, he said breathlessly, could I have George and Zack and Carrie and Ginny up here in this room? Don't see why not. They've been thrown out of their homes. No, it's just there ain't much room at George's, and Zack says... No need to explain. This is your room. You does what you like, only... He warned, pointing his pipe in Willie's direction. If there's any mess, you has to clear it up. Understand? Yeah, course, said Willie. When is they wanting to come? Friday. Friday 'tis then. He stood up and kissed his forehead. Night, lad, he said quietly. Mr. Tom, said Willie as he turned the lamp down. Yes? They don't know about, and he patted the blankets with his hands. The bedwetting? You ain't ashamed of that, is you? Willie nodded. Ain't no need to mention it. I'll make your bed up before the evening so they won't see the rubber. That do? Yeah, ta. The room was blanketed in darkness until Tom removed the blackout curtain. Night, he said again, and he disappeared down the steps, closing the trapdoor after him. Willie leaned his head back on his upraised hand. He glanced at the slanting window pane. The rain was running down the glass in tiny, sparkling rivulets. He snuggled down into the warm blankets. He never thought that he would ever come to love the rain, but he did now. The last thing he remembered before falling asleep was the patter, patter, patter of it gently and rhythmically hitting the tiled roof above his head. And the next chapter is called Friday. So I will read that one to you next time. Okay? Hope you're well. Really miss you guys. Maybe leave me a comment if you enjoyed this. And yes, speak to you soon. Bye.